In the early days of April 1945, on the slopes of Mount Kakazu in Okinawa, Japanese units still firmly believed that night was a time when they held an absolute tactical advantage. Japan's military history had proven this over more than 4 decades, from the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, where Japanese units used night attacks to penetrate what seemed like impenetrable Russian defenses at Port Arthur, to campaigns in China during the 1930s, where night infiltration and attacks became a hallmark of their tactics. Across the Pacific battlefield, from Guadalcanal to Burma, Japanese night raiding units repeatedly inflicted heavy losses on Allied forces, demonstrating that in darkness, skill, discipline, and preparation could overcome any technological advantage the enemy possessed. This theory was not merely a belief, it was reinforced by analysis and empirical data. Japanese night attacks from 1942 to 1944 accounted for roughly 30% of total engagement time, but caused up to 60% of U.S. casualties. These figures reflected not only tactical efficiency, but also affirmed that Japanese mastery of the night was a crucial part of their war strategy. The Japanese spent years perfecting night training methods, creating soldiers who were nearly born for the dark. They practiced moving silently through jungles, swamps, and enemy defenses without leaving a trace. Units were trained to identify enemy weapons and equipment by sound alone, distinguishing, for example, the reload of an M1 Garand from a bar at a distance of 50 yards. Soldiers were also trained in complete darkness, learning to assemble and operate weapons by touch and to communicate through subtle taps or sounds to maintain secrecy and avoid detection. The Japanese developed sophisticated night combat procedures, focusing infiltration on gaps in enemy lines, approaching supply routes or strategic positions that the opponent could not defend. These skills, honed over decades, made each Japanese soldier a dangerous asset in the dark, capable of inflicting maximum damage on the enemy while minimizing risk to themselves. Belief in the power of night was reinforced, not only by combat experience, but also through Japanese training manuals and tactical guides. A manual captured and translated by the U.S. in 1944 emphasized night levels all technological advantages. In darkness, warrior spirit and training overcome all mechanical superiority. A Japanese soldier trained for night operations can equal 10 enemies reliant on technology. This was not mere propaganda. It reflected a deep strategic perspective on dominance in low-light conditions. Specific examples from Guadalcanal in 1942, such as Edson's Ridge and Henderson Field, illustrated the danger of night attacks. Although U.S. Marine forces ultimately prevailed, they admitted that Japanese infiltrations nearly drove them into the sea, and only emergency defensive measures combined with a bit of luck prevented disaster. U.S. operational research statistics showed that Japanese units caused significantly higher casualties at night than during the day, demonstrating the effectiveness of this tactic. Japanese night tactics were not just about training, they were a military culture. Soldiers were expected to exploit darkness to compensate for technological and numerical limitations. At night, they became ghost-like, silently approaching targets, reminiscent of the phantoms described in U.S. operational reports. They not only moved silently, but also knew how to use gunfire, noise, and shadows to confuse the enemy. These skills were cultivated through real combat experience and simulated low-light conditions, including moving through jungles, climbing mountains, and using natural materials to conceal traces. Japanese soldiers could even predict enemy behavior based on sound and darkness, something Allied forces often could not respond to in time. For 3 years before Okinawa, Japan had almost exclusive mastery of night tactics in the Pacific. They used darkness to deploy elite infiltration units, strike weak points in U.S. defenses, inflict high casualties, and erode enemy morale. This form of combat was not only militarily effective, but also created a significant psychological advantage. U.S. forces had to remain constantly alert, fearing attacks at any moment in the dark. Japanese soldiers were trained to use night as an invisible weapon, where personal skill and experience outweighed any enemy technology. All U.S. defensive strategies had to assume that Japan would actively exploit darkness, forcing them to allocate additional troops, lighting equipment, or costly precautionary measures without any guarantee of maximum effectiveness. A key factor in Japanese nighttime dominance was the emphasis on psychological and combat spirit training. Japanese soldiers were taught that in darkness, courage, discipline, and personal preparedness were decisive. At night, Each soldier could create their own advantage, using the dark environment to counter a stronger or better armed enemy. Movement, reloading, and communication under low-light conditions became essential survival skills, and every action had to be performed with precision. This training not only enhanced combat capability, but also instilled the confidence that Japanese soldiers would always hold an edge in the dark. Regardless of any advanced technology employed by the opponent, Japanese night attacks were rarely isolated actions. They were often calculated campaigns targeting supply lines, command centers, or strategic positions. They used darkness to minimize risk and maximize enemy damage. The sophistication of these tactics lay in moving along carefully reconnoitered routes, using sound or touch signals to maintain contact, and coordinating synchronized attacks from multiple directions. Even elite U.S. forces, when confronted with Japanese night infiltrations, often had to rely on anticipation, intuition, and luck, further proving that Japanese dominance in night combat was real, not theoretical. Japanese tactics, training, and military culture converged on one point. The night was their domain, where skill, discipline, and combat spirit determined outcomes more than any weapon or technology. History, from the Russo-Japanese War to campaigns in China and the Pacific War, showed that Japan had achieved near-perfect mastery of night combat. This created an illusion of absolute advantage, convincing them that maintaining control of the night could offset any technological or numerical challenge. This belief, honed over decades, became an integral part of Japanese strategic thinking at Okinawa and would serve as a benchmark against the technological revolution soon to be introduced by the U.S. The first infrared devices in modern warfare. In the context of Japanese dominance in night combat across the Pacific, the U.S. military recognized the urgent need to find a method to counterbalance this advantage. After years of fighting, American forces had suffered heavy casualties in Japanese night infiltration attacks, particularly at Guadalcanal, where Japanese units moved through darkness like ghosts, striking defensive positions unexpectedly and causing significant damage. Field reports indicated that traditional measures could hardly overcome Japanese night skills. Artificial lighting, such as searchlights, flares, or spotlights, proved insufficient because the enemy moved extremely stealthily, using darkness itself as camouflage. Consequently, the U.S. began researching technologies that could provide a similar advantage, allowing them to see in the dark to prevent infiltrations and regain the initiative. The concept of infrared technology began official development in 1943, when the U.S. National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, realized that night observation could be a turning point in warfare. RCA, Radio Corporation of America, which had been developing image intensifier tubes since the mid-1930s, started researching tubes capable of converting infrared light into images visible to the human eye. The result was the P25 tube, an image intensifier capable of transforming infrared light, normally invisible to the eye, into a green-hued image that soldiers could observe directly. This marked a groundbreaking advancement. For the first time, humans could see targets in complete darkness without any visible light source, breaking the traditional advantage held by the Japanese. The system was mounted directly onto the M2 Carbine, a widely used U.S. light rifle, and was called the T3 Carbine during testing, later standardized as the M3 Carbine. Its operating principle was relatively simple but highly effective. An infrared lamp mounted above the barrel emitted invisible light forward. This light reflected off objects and was captured by the P25 infrared sight, amplified, and converted into a visible image. This allowed U.S. soldiers to clearly see moving targets in the dark at distances of 125 yards, distances where Japanese troops believed they were completely concealed. The observed image was typically green, detailed enough to identify soldiers, weapons, and even rank. During testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground, shooters achieved roughly an 80% hit rate on man-sized targets at 70 yards in total. Darkness, a feat unprecedented. In infantry warfare history, this development was more than a technological improvement. It represented a combination of optical science, electronics, and military tactics. The system included the rifle, sight, infrared lamp, and a battery weighing around 28-30 pounds, a substantial load for mobile infantry units, but the benefits far outweighed the weight drawback. Each unit was a complete package, turning U.S. soldiers into night marksmen, where superior observation created an almost absolute tactical advantage. Due to complexity and production cost, the number of units was limited. Approximately 1,700 P25 sights were produced. of which only about 150 complete systems were deployed to the Pacific Theater, primarily for units operating in Okinawa. U.S. soldiers were carefully selected to operate this system, based not only on marksmanship but also on psychological resilience and emotional stability. Using a device that allowed them to shoot enemies they could not see created tremendous psychological pressure, and these marksmen bore significant responsibility for protecting defensive positions, preventing infiltrations, and maintaining absolute secrecy about the equipment. Strict security measures were enforced. Operators underwent over 40 hours of training, including theory on infrared light, image intensification, equipment maintenance, battery management, range estimation, target identification, and security protocols. If threatened by capture, the device had to be destroyed with an accompanying thermite grenade to prevent it from falling into enemy hands, underscoring its strategic value. The introduction of the T3M3 carbine with infrared sight revolutionized night combat tactics. Previously, Japanese night attacks were nearly impossible to counter with traditional methods. U.S. forces relied on artificial light, listening for sounds or guessing enemy positions. Now, thanks to infrared technology, U.S. soldiers could detect enemies and shoot accurately without revealing their positions, completely undermining the advantage the Japanese had built over more than 40 years. For the first time in military history, darkness was no longer a natural advantage for one side. Instead, it became a tactical tool under American control. Another critical aspect was the strategic deployment of the device, targeting areas with high Japanese infiltration potential, such as supply routes, mountain passes, and key defensive positions. Limiting deployment to about 2 units per company in vital zones did not reduce effectiveness. Rather, it created a strong psychological effect, leaving the Japanese uncertain about where they might be observed. Even suspicion of the technology's existence altered their behavior, reducing night movements, delaying traditional infiltrations, and creating tactical uncertainty. The development of infrared was not just technological, but also a coordinated integration of science, engineering, and tactics. RCA provided solutions for light amplification, batteries, and infrared lamps, while U.S. units tested the most effective deployment methods, from positioning marksmen and coordinating observation to target selection and attack tactics. The system was designed for total darkness but had clear limitations. Batteries lasted only 20-30 minutes, device weight restricted mobility, and effectiveness decreased significantly in rain, fog, or smoke. Nevertheless, these limitations were never discovered or exploited by the Japanese, leaving them completely surprised by the device's effectiveness in actual combat. An additional notable aspect was the psychological impact. Shooting enemies who could not see you, while you could observe them clearly, created a unique mental pressure for U.S. marksmen. They not only prevented infiltrations, but also experienced a sense of invisibility on the battlefield, a new form of psychological power in modern warfare. This simultaneously caused panic and significantly lowered Japanese morale, as troops who had long relied on night superiority were now facing an enemy that could see them clearly. The advent of U.S. infrared technology marked a turning point in modern infantry warfare, allowing one side to fully control darkness for the first time, breaking a tactical advantage that had existed for over 4 decades. It was not merely a technical innovation, but a shift in tactical thinking. From now on, light and visibility became decisive factors in victory, rather than relying solely on numbers, experience, or individual skill. The T3M3 carbine with infrared sight ushered in a new era, where technology shaped battle outcomes and transformed the nature of war from a traditional contest of skill into a contest of superior observation and information. When the Battle of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945, U.S. forces were prepared not only with conventional weapons, but also with an entirely new technology, the T3M3 carbine equipped with an infrared sight. This marked the first time in World War history that a night vision device was deployed operationally on the battlefield, specifically to counter an enemy that had long dominated in darkness. The Japanese, who had relied on night infiltration as a core tactic, now faced a wholly new reality. Part of the U.S. force could see them in the dark, identify individual soldiers and weapons, and react accurately without revealing their positions. The combination of technology, tactics, and psychological impact produced results far beyond expectations. The infrared devices were distributed strategically. Each U.S. company typically received only 2 T3M3 rifles, concentrated in areas where Japanese infiltrations were expected most: supply routes, mountain passes, positions near command posts, and vulnerable sections of defensive lines. The limited number of devices did not reduce effectiveness. Instead, it created tactical uncertainty for the Japanese, who could not know whether a particular area was being monitored. From the outset, reports indicated that traditional Japanese infiltrations encountered significant failure, causing panic and altering enemy behavior. On the first night of the campaign, from April 1 to 2, Japanese units, as usual, attempted infiltrations into U.S. positions. These units had long been trained in night observation skills dating back to the Russo-Japanese War, practiced moving in complete darkness, recognizing sounds, signs, and even detecting enemy positions by smell. However, they did not realize that the Americans now possessed the ability to see them in the dark. U.S. marksmen, using the T3M3 carbine, observed Japanese soldiers moving, selected targets, and fired with high precision without revealing their positions. Within hours, the infiltrations were entirely stopped. Many Japanese soldiers were killed without being able to retaliate, while U.S. units suffered no casualties from these attacks. Official reports from U.S. divisions, such as the 96th and 7th Infantry Divisions, clearly described the effectiveness of the infrared devices. Marksmen were deployed to create an overlapping observation network, ensuring that any movement would be monitored. When a target was detected, marksmen fired accurately and, if necessary, called in artillery or mortars to eliminate larger groups. This tactic, known as infrared ambush defense, turned the ability to see the enemy at night into a tool for controlling the battlefield, causing Japanese troops to lose almost all confidence in night movement. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound. Reports noted that after just the first few nights, many night infiltration units were destroyed or disbanded before reaching U.S. positions. Soldiers, who had long prided themselves on their nighttime mobility, now panicked when seeing comrades shot in darkness without being able to locate the enemy. They began avoiding night movements, reducing traditional attacks, and altering tactics, sometimes waiting until daylight or dawn to approach U.S. positions. This significantly reduced the overall effectiveness of Japanese defenses, making supply lines and strategic positions easier for U.S. forces to control. U.S. infrared marksmen were thoroughly trained, not only in device operation, but also in night combat tactics. They learned to select positions, manage heavy batteries, move sparingly, conceal themselves, and coordinate with artillery. In reports, Technical Sergeant John Murray of the 96th Infantry Division described his experience using the infrared sight. Through the scope, Japanese soldiers appeared as bright green figures against the dark background. Every movement and weapon was identifiable. You see their confidence, but the moment you fire, panic shows in every motion. They don't understand how we can see them. This account reflects the psychological dominance that the technology provided, creating an advantage far beyond conventional means. The effectiveness of the T3M3 carbines extended beyond hitting targets. They also prevented future infiltrations. Once a route was observed and attacked successfully, Japanese forces often abandoned it entirely, afraid to try again. Some key routes were left unguarded, allowing U.S. forces to control strategic areas without deploying large numbers of troops. Reports indicate that in the first week of the campaign, approximately 30% of Japanese nighttime casualties were caused by infrared marksmen, even though the devices accounted for less than 1% of all U.S. weapons present. This demonstrates an extremely high tactical return on investment, with each device potentially altering the outcome of an entire sector of the battlefield. The Japanese, with disciplined training and combat spirit, still tried to understand American nighttime capabilities. They gathered intelligence from captured documents and observed U.S. soldiers, but most attempts were mere guesses. Some units speculated that the Americans used vision-enhancing drugs or sophisticated optical devices, but no one could determine the exact mechanism of the T3M3 carbine. This lack of understanding increased the effectiveness of the technology, as the Japanese developed no effective countermeasures. Alongside tactical and psychological effects, reports also noted technical limitations that the U.S. learned during deployment. The heavy battery provided only 20-30 minutes of continuous operation. The device's weight limited rapid movement, and performance dropped significantly in rain, fog, or smoke. However, the Japanese were unaware of these limitations, and U.S. marksmen were trained to maximize favorable conditions, hold fixed positions, fire accurately, and move quickly after shooting. This tactic made it nearly impossible for Japanese units to retaliate or trace the source of fire. Though the Battle of Okinawa also demonstrated that infrared technology affected not just individual engagements but the entire Japanese defensive strategy. The 32nd Army, responsible for defending Okinawa, had planned to use night infiltrations to resupply, move troops, gather intelligence, and counterattack. Upon realizing that infiltrations were being observed and effectively fired upon, most nighttime plans had to be abandoned, leaving supply lines cut, strategic positions isolated, and inter-unit coordination difficult. The deeply layered and connected defensive system planned by General Ushima was disrupted. Bases became fixed points vulnerable to attack, and Japanese forces were limited to daytime operations, where they had lost all tactical advantage. Another critical aspect was the long-term effect on psychological warfare. Infrared technology undermined Japanese confidence in controlling the night, a symbol of their soldiers' skill and power. Fear and uncertainty spread, reducing morale and combat effectiveness not only in areas with deployed devices, but also in zones without them. Many Japanese soldiers refused to leave dugouts and caves after recognizing American presence, losing tactical initiative and coordination. The Okinawa campaign also recorded specific battlefield results. One example from the 96th Infantry Division, on April 15th, an infrared marksman detected and fired on a Japanese patrol of 12 soldiers at 75 yards, killing 8 without U.S. casualties, with the remainder fleeing. On April 28th, another infrared position detected a Japanese supply team at 0230 hours, eliminating 6 soldiers and destroying supplies with artillery directed by the marksman. These incidents illustrate how night observation capability changed engagement outcomes and battlefield control. During the campaign, the U.S. continued refining infrared tactics. They deployed fixed ambush positions along infiltration routes, water sources, mountain passes, and gaps in defensive lines, creating zones of unpredictable observation. Marksmen fired selectively, allowing some movement to go unpunished, generating uncertainty and fear among Japanese forces, who could not know which night actions would result in losses. This exemplifies how technology combined with psychological warfare to produce superior results. The combination of advanced technology, disciplined tactics, and psychological impact made Okinawa a successful trial for the U.S. infrared system. Only about 150 devices deployed across the campaign significantly altered the night combat situation. Japanese troops, confident in their nighttime skill and experience, were forced to change tactics, abandon traditional infiltrations, limit movements, and focus on daytime defense. Deeply layered defensive systems, designed for continuous day and night operations, were disrupted, allowing U.S. forces to isolate and eliminate strategic points easily. The success rate of infiltrations dropped sharply. U.S. nighttime casualties decreased significantly, and overall Japanese combat effectiveness suffered severely. Although U.S. infrared technology at the Battle of Okinawa provided a decisive advantage in observing and eliminating Japanese forces at night, the T3M3 Carbine system also had significant technical limitations. The system weighed approximately 28-30 pounds, including the carbine, infrared sight, battery, and infrared lamp. Its heavy weight made marksmen almost immobile, forcing them to operate from fixed positions. This limited their ability to maneuver flexibly and respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions. Moreover, the lead-acid battery provided only 20-30 minutes of continuous operation. While intermittent use could extend this to several hours, it required careful energy management and activation only when necessary. Weather conditions posed another limitation. Rain, fog, smoke, and dust could reduce the effectiveness of infrared light, scattering or obscuring the observed image. In particular, smoke and artillery fires could create halos or shadows, complicating target identification. Additionally, certain types of munitions, such as white phosphorus, could temporarily disable the device. However, on the Okinawa battlefield, the Japanese were unaware of these limitations, and U.S. marksmen were trained to exploit favorable conditions, occupy fixed positions, fire accurately, and move immediately after shooting. This created tactical surprise, leaving Japanese forces nearly unable to respond or trace the source of fire. Another critical factor was secrecy in training. The infrared system was highly classified, and only select marksmen were trained to use it. They underwent approximately 40 hours of intensive training, including infrared light theory, image intensifier principles, device maintenance and repair, target identification and distance estimation within the characteristic green image, battery management and conservation, deployment and concealment tactics, and strict security measures to prevent the device from falling into enemy hands. Each unit came with a thermite grenade for destruction if capture was threatened, demonstrating the strategic importance and value of the technology. In this context, Japanese responses were largely speculative, based on observation and deduction. They did not know that the Americans were using infrared lamps and image-intensifying sights, so they could not develop effective countermeasures. Some units speculated that the Americans were using night vision drugs or advanced optical devices, leading to bizarre experiments, such as consuming large amounts of vitamin A or covering their bodies with mud to avoid detection, which were entirely ineffective. Reports from the Japanese 62nd Division on April 20, 1945, acknowledged that the U.S. possessed near-miraculous night observation capability, yet they did not know the precise mechanism. A Japanese technical officer noted, "The Americans use artificial light invisible to the human eye. Detection method unknown. Cannot respond with current equipment." While this assessment was close to the active principle of the infrared system, the Japanese could not exploit it to develop countermeasures. As a result, Japanese night infiltration units quickly lost effectiveness. After the first nights, many soldiers feared leaving bunkers, caves, or concealed positions in the dark. Tactics that had been trained and refined over 4 decades, from the Russo-Japanese War to Guadalcanal campaigns, became useless. Supply routes, key positions, and deeply layered defenses were no longer used as before. Japanese forces began limiting nighttime operations, causing logistical bottlenecks, isolating units, reducing coordination, and increasing the risk of illness and exhaustion within caves and bunkers. Additionally, the U.S. exploited Japanese tactical and psychological uncertainty to maximize effectiveness. Infrared marksmen were deployed in overlapping ambush patterns, creating a wide observation network unknown to the enemy. In some cases, infiltrations were allowed to pass unchallenged, creating the impression that detection was random, keeping Japanese forces in constant fear and unable to move confidently. The combination of the device's physical capability and psychological tactics forced fundamental changes in Japanese behavior. Abandoning tactics developed over decades. Official U.S. reports indicate that, although T3M3 devices were limited, only about 150 units deployed across the entire campaign, infrared-equipped. Units accounted for up to 30% of Japanese nighttime casualties in the first week, even though the total number of U.S. weapons far exceeded this. This demonstrates the extraordinary tactical efficiency of a strategically deployed advanced technology capable of altering battlefield outcomes far beyond its physical presence. Japan also faced intelligence and information limitations. Despite attempts to gather data from captured documents, observe U.S. marksmen, and record unusual phenomena, they failed to discern the nature of the infrared technology. Countermeasure experiments were largely speculative, such as using mud or reflective materials to avoid detection, but proved ineffective. This ignorance amplified the psychological effect. Japanese forces could not identify safe zones, resulting in panic, overcautious behavior, and a decline in overall combat effectiveness. The consequences lasted throughout the campaign. Restricted nighttime operations directly impacted logistics, coordination, and overall defensive capability. Japanese units in caves and bunkers became isolated, unable to receive supplies or move troops. Communication became difficult as couriers and messengers, who normally moved at night, could not operate safely. The deeply layered defensive system designed by General Ushima became fixed, vulnerable points, and the ability to coordinate tactics was nearly destroyed. Personal notes from Japanese officers described the situation. Night infiltrations were entirely eliminated. Soldiers feared leaving shelters, and surface movement was only permitted during the day. Where they lost their tactical advantage, night tactics, which were the backbone of Japanese operations, from position holding, supply, troop movements to counterattacks, were completely disrupted. Beyond immediate combat effects, infrared technology shattered soldiers' confidence in controlling the night, a critical factor in their morale cultivated over many years. Meanwhile, the U.S. also had to contend with the technical and tactical limitations of the system. Heavy batteries, device weight, and reduced effectiveness in adverse weather required marksmen to choose positions wisely and manage power carefully. However, these limitations were offset by fixed deployment tactics, artillery coordination, and the psychological uncertainty imposed on the Japanese, which they could not explain. Strict secrecy also prevented the devices from falling into enemy hands, ensuring that the technological advantage was maintained throughout the campaign. In summary, the Japanese response to infrared technology combined fear, speculation, and passive tactical adjustment. They could not develop effective countermeasures because the system's nature was unknown, leading to the abandonment of nighttime infiltrations, restricted movement, and total reliance on daytime operations, where the U.S. held the advantage. American technical limitations, though present, were never recognized or exploited by the Japanese, allowing the infrared technological advantage to be maximized throughout the campaign. The Battle of Okinawa in the spring of 1945 was not only the final decisive engagement of the Pacific War, but also a turning point in military history, marking the first effective tactical use of infrared technology. Although only about 150 T3M3 carbines equipped with infrared sights were deployed, these devices had an impact far beyond their numbers, fundamentally altering how Japanese forces conducted nighttime operations. The tactical legacy and lessons from Okinawa affected not only the immediate outcome of the battle, but also shaped decades of subsequent military development for both the U.S. and its adversaries. First, the direct impact of infrared technology was the transformation of the nighttime battlefield. Prior to Okinawa, darkness was the Japanese forces' greatest tactical advantage. Night infiltration units were trained over multiple campaigns to exploit the invisibility of night. Japanese soldiers could move silently, identify weapons, distinguish enemy activity by sound, and strike with remarkable precision. In campaigns such as Guadalcanal and Edson's Ridge, U.S. forces had suffered heavy losses due to Japanese dominance in the dark. Infrared completely reversed this advantage, making darkness an ally of the Americans rather than the Japanese. A single U.S. marksman with a fixed infrared sight along a defensive line could render traditional Japanese infiltration operations nearly impossible. This created an extremely strong psychological effect, forcing the Japanese to abandon tactics they had trusted for decades. Another critical aspect was information dominance and the ability to achieve a local superiority over the enemy. Infrared sights allowed U.S. forces to see without being seen, a fundamental principle of battlefield dominance. From target identification to distance estimation and fire decisions, all actions were conducted with absolute informational advantage. Meanwhile, the Japanese were entirely unaware of the enemy's presence, unable to predict observation points, leading to panic and disorientation. The psychological effect of not knowing whether one was being watched was even greater than the physical threat of being fired upon. This underscores an essential lesson. In modern warfare, control of information and the ability to observe the enemy can yield decisive advantages, sometimes more so than increasing weapons or manpower. From a tactical perspective, Okinawa demonstrated that traditional advantages could be neutralized by new technology. The Japanese had long prided themselves on nighttime combat capability, viewing it as a core part of their military identity. Skills such as silent movement, target identification by sound, and sophisticated coordination in the dark all became useless against U.S. infrared sights. This not only reduced nighttime combat effectiveness, but also inflicted deep psychological damage, eroding Japanese confidence in their traditional combat capabilities. The clear lesson from Okinawa: a superior technology can dismantle an entire tactical system built on long experience. The long-term legacy of this event is evident in U.S. post-war military technology development. After Okinawa, the U.S. recognized that control of darkness was a strategic factor and heavily invested in nighttime observation systems. During the Korean War, improved M3 carbines with infrared scopes were deployed, creating a significant psychological advantage against Chinese and North Korean forces, many of whom initially believed that all U.S. units had night vision capabilities. This restricted enemy nighttime activity, which the U.S. exploited to strike or maneuver unopposed. The Okinawa experience became a standard for training and deploying night observation technology, from selecting marksmen and tactical positioning to device security, energy management, and coordination with artillery. Beyond tactical impact, Okinawa also sparked debate on ethics in warfare. Infrared sights allowed soldiers to kill opponents who had little chance of effective resistance. Many marksmen reported feeling more like executioners than soldiers, observing and eliminating enemies over extended periods. This psychological strain differed from daytime combat. Post-war U.S. military researchers and ethicists noted that infrared marksmen experienced higher combat stress than regular soldiers, raising the question of whether using technology to neutralize an enemy's ability to resist could be considered legitimate warfare. The prevailing view accepted that any technology saving Allied lives was justified, but the associated psychological burden remained a subject of discussion. The long-term impact on Japanese forces was equally pronounced. They realized that advantages in training, morale, and individual skill could be nullified by superior technology, a lesson later applied in their own efforts to develop optical warfare capabilities. In the records and memoirs of surviving Okinawa officers, they acknowledged that defeat was not merely a matter of firepower or numbers, but of failure to adapt to a form of warfare beyond human perception. This reinforced the reality that in a technological era, those who control information and sensory advantage hold the decisive edge on the battlefield. Okinawa also proved that technological innovations, even in limited numbers, can produce profound tactical and strategic effects. With only 150 devices deployed, the U.S. fundamentally altered nighttime combat, forcing Japanese forces to abandon their primary infiltration tactics. U.S. reports noted that in areas with infrared devices, successful infiltration operations dropped by up to 78%, and the effective engagement range increased from the usual 10-15 yards to over 70 yards. As enemy nighttime operations stalled, the effect rippled across the entire front. Supply lines were disrupted, inter-unit communications severed, and overall coordination and defense capabilities were significantly diminished. These figures demonstrate that the tactical and psychological impact of technology can far exceed its physical presence. Another lasting legacy is the military mindset regarding technology and information. Okinawa taught the U.S. and future forces that surprise and technological innovation are strategic weapons, not just to physically defeat the enemy, but to induce confusion, fear, and paralysis of opposing tactics. This principle became fundamental during the Cold War, the Korean and Vietnam conflicts, and continues to influence modern campaigns, where control of data, sensory advantage, and the ability to see the enemy are decisive factors. Okinawa also exemplified the relationship between technology, humans, and tactics. While advanced infrared devices allowed seeing in the dark, maximum effectiveness depended on well-trained marksmen, proper tactical deployment, and strict device security. This emphasizes that technology cannot function in isolation. It must be integrated with human understanding, operational expertise, and exploitation of its advantages. Another key lesson concerns the psychological and behavioral ripple effects of technology. Deploying only a limited number of devices, but creating the perception that anywhere could be observed, forced Japanese forces to abandon all nighttime tactics, even in areas without equipment. This demonstrates that uncertainty and fear generated by technology can have a strategic impact exceeding its physical power. This concept later became a guiding principle in modern warfare, with surveillance systems, drones, and electronic sensors used to achieve information dominance without direct physical presence. Finally, Okinawa ushered in a new era for nighttime warfare. From the original M3 carbine with infrared sight, night observation technology evolved through multiple generations. Active infrared systems, passive light amplification devices such as starlight scopes, and ultimately modern thermal imaging and comprehensive observation systems capable of detecting targets kilometers away under all weather conditions without active illumination. The principles derived from Okinawa, information control, sensory dominance, psychological impact, remain foundational in modern military strategy. In a broader view, Okinawa demonstrated that technology can shape military thinking and organization, overturn long-held beliefs, and create decisive strategic advantages. Japanese forces, proud of their skill, training, and nighttime tactics, learned a bitter lesson. In modern warfare, human advantage can be nullified by technology, and those who wield technological superiority dominate. Japan's failure of imagination, combined with U.S. technological innovation and tactical deployment, helped accelerate the end of the Pacific War and set standards for modern warfare. Okinawa also left a strategic legacy for later conflicts, from Korea and Vietnam to contemporary campaigns. Owning the night became a strategic goal, controlling the enemy's perception, observing without being observed, and achieving a superior psychological edge. In many cases, psychological impact proved even more decisive than physical effect, as a paralyzed enemy could not exploit their own tactical advantages. Overall, Okinawa illustrated 3 key lessons. First, technological surprise is amplified by psychological effects. Second, undermining basic tactical assumptions can collapse entire defensive and training systems. Third, information control and observation capabilities constitute decisive battlefield advantage, surpassing both troop numbers and firepower. These lessons shaped U.S. strategic thinking throughout the Cold War and continue to influence modern military operations. Ultimately, the legacy of Okinawa's infrared technology was not just a tactical victory but a milestone in modern military philosophy. Those who control information, command technology, and dominate perception hold the advantage, and darkness is no